Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation for such nice park of rivers and streams and bogs and forests. I'm Paweł Pawlaczyk from Poland. For every day, I'm working in the Polish NGO Naturalist Club Poland, but I'm involved in some works with rivers, with Waterfall Directive implementation in Poland, with river restoration program. River restoration program in Poland, and a lot of other work in nature conservation. So I'm going to talk about mainly about European system of legal river protection and European system of management of water bodies, but with some accents, with some elements of my personal experience and how this system may be used for nature conservation in context of river. First question is, what for? Why rivers need conservation and what the conservation means? My perspective is the first, rivers are ecosystems. And as each ecosystem has some natural mechanisms, natural structure and function, natural processes, which processes may be degraded by the human alteration, by the river regulation, but by various investments, by building dams, but not only by such big projects, also by some activities, such so-called rivers maintenance work. It is recurrent works of deepening of the subsections of the rivers, etc., etc., etc. And all this pressure may importantly affect the ecosystem structure and function. Then, first, conservation is protection against some human activities degrading river, but not only against the big investments, but also against some small activities, which taken together may be even most important than single investments which deteriorate the nature. But the protection against is not enough, maybe not in Lithuania, but in more western part of Europe, starting from Poland, but also in the western Europe. A lot of rivers are degraded now, which means they need restoration. They need repairing natural processes and restoring rivers as functioning ecosystems. The conservation needs also enforcing necessary restoration of some rivers and some rivers sections. A central piece of European legislation about water management, about water at all, is of course so-called Waterfall Directive. But some other pieces of European legislation are also important and may be supported, as the so-called nature directives, which means habitats and birds ones. Nitrate directive, which is important tool for preventing rivers from the pollution from agriculture, from the eutrophication by nitrogen from agriculture. So-called liability directive, which is about cases of so-called environmental damage, with the general rule that each damage must be remediated, prevented first, remediated if they occur. And environmental impact assessment directive, which established some procedure for considering possible impact before authorization investments which may degrade river. Of course, there are also national legislation, but in case of member states of European Union, all national legislation must transport this piece of European law, and all that directive must be included to the national one. Of course, the national solution may be various in details, but only in details. Some rules, which I'm going to presenting now, are common for all European Union and not always are properly understood. They are not always properly understood also in transposition in some countries, but for effective using the legal tools, we must enforce proper transposition of this rule to each national legislation at the beginning. If in your national legislation something is other than the general rules and the European interpretation, probably the national legislation needs some improvement, and we may be rather sure that at least until we are still a member of European Union, we may be rather sure that earlier or later this transposition will be corrected and will reflect the context of the directive. This central piece, the Water Framework Directive, is a short name of the Directive 2016 European Commission from the October of 2000 year, establishing a framework for community action in the field of the water policy. But the Water Framework Directive is a common short name, which is normally used. What is the context of the directive? First is the rule of catchment planning, that all management of all waters is planned in the scale of the whole catchment. It means that all member states are obliged to prepare the plans for 6 years and update the plan for the next 6 years periods, which cover the catchments and which catchment so-called river basins. This is the rather big areas, such as, for example, Nemunas River Basin, Vistula River Basin, and Poland, etc., etc., etc. The main idea of the water management in the directive is a planning in the 6-year planning cycle. The status of each water unit, the water unit is so-called water body. This is the section of water which should be homogeneous. Of course, it's much more complicated. I will come back to this later. But for each part of the water, as for example for the river Gruda, so-called the status of the river body must be assessed. The status of the river body is composed from the 2 parts, the assessment of the so-called ecological status and so-called chemical status. Don't be surprised, the more common pollutants as nitrogen and phosphorus, as the so-called nutrients, the eutrophication substances, are not the part of chemical status, are the part of ecological status and part of so-called physiochemical elements. There are some strange points in the directive. What is the traditional thinking is that some chemicals, some pollutants are the chemicals, but not here. The chemical status is about pollutants, but about very specific toxic substances. The most common pollutants are among the ecological status, not among the chemical ones. The main of the directive is the ban for deterioration of the status of the water body. It is the general rule with the very small possibility of making exceptions from that. The status is assessed in the 5 classes: high, good, moderate, poor, and bad. And the general objective is to have finally all water bodies in the good status. In the good status, which means both good ecological status and good chemical status. which means not a perfect, not a high one, but good is still rather good. For each water body in the 6-year plan, the so-called environmental objective must be established. Normally, the objective is to achieve the good status of the water body, which means good ecological status and good chemical one. But if we have the very natural river in good condition, which now has the high ecological status, the environmental objective is not to deteriorate. The environmental objective is to maintain the high ecological status. If we have the strongly transformed the river, like a channel, the objectives are sometimes less restrictive because there are some exemptions from that general rule. And the element of each 6-year plan for river basin water management is the proactive part, is so-called the program of measures, which lists all things which need to be implemented for achieving the environmental objectives indeed. There are the time limits to achieving the good ecological and good chemical status. The basic deadline is good. It's 2015. Now we have 2021. Then each member states which has not achieved good status or good potential of at least one of the river body on their territory is not fully following the directive, with the exception. With the exception, some of the exceptions allow the postponing the deadline. It may be postponed to 2021, just now. It may be also postponed to 2027, but in general, not more. 2027 is the final deadline for the following Water Framework Directive requirements. And of course, the obligation is monitoring, which is necessary to control what the status really is and is the objectives really meet. What is important for the assessment of the status of the river body, so-called quality elements must be recognized. The most important are so-called biological elements, which means in rivers, aquatic flora, benthic fauna, and fish. Not birds, for example, but that's 3 biological elements which are used for river, in fact, cover most of the ecological characteristics of river ecosystems and are very good indicators, but only if we look at the 3, not only for one of them. Sometimes in lakes also the plankton is taken under consideration. This is the growth of the biological elements. This is the most important one. As the supporting quality elements, the hydromorphology is assessed and so-called physiochemical elements, including, for example, nutrients, pollution by nitrogen, pollution by phosphorus, salinity, physical characteristics as the conductivity of the water. These are among the group of physicochemical elements. And the general assessment of the status is based on that elements. But it is a bit complicated. I will come to this issue a bit later because it is important for understanding what the status really means, how it is assessed, and how the objectives may be interpreted if we are going to use the legal instrument for and use the environmental objectives for example, preventing river deterioration by particular investments or enforce the river restoration. The important part of the directive, I presented the general rule, but the important part of the directive are exceptions. There are several ones. First is designation the river as so-called highly modified water body, which means that if the river is altered by human activity, and if the river hydromorphology is degraded, and the transformation is still necessary for important human purposes, it may be established the objectives to achieve of so-called good potential, good ecological potential, instead of good ecological status. And good ecological potential may be a bit less restrictive, but maybe must be established as the best status which can achieve with still maintaining the alteration we need for some human purposes. This designation is rather restrictive. The situation, if the river is degraded, but we cannot provide proof what for it is degraded, is not the condition which allow us to designate this as highly modified water body. Which means if we have degraded river, for example, regulated in the past, but we don't know what the alterations are for now, which with the elements of the degradation, with the hydromorphological alteration are not necessary for any important purposes, it means that there is hard obligation to restore the river to the natural condition and to achieve finally good ecological status, not establish the less restrictive good ecological potential. The second possibility is the prolongation of the deadline. As I say, the general deadline for achieving good status was 2015. There is the possibility to prolong this deadline in some situations. If there is no feasible for the technical point of view to do it in the original deadline. If the doing it in the original deadline is disproportionately expensive, or if the natural conditions of the ecosystems are require a longer time, for example, if the river or lake needs time to react on restoration measures implementation. But the prolongation may be general no longer than 2027, which may be important problem for politicians and for river managers, because 2027 is, in fact, in 6 years. It's very close deadline. And the only possibility is the situation that we implement the restoration measures, all necessary restoration measures before this date, and accept that some reaction of the ecosystem will be a bit longer. The next possibility is to establish the less stringent environmental objectives if the human activity serving important environmental or socioeconomic needs not possible to be replaced by the better environmental options, needs the some less restrictive objectives, but this is not very often used. The next exemption is the acceptation for the temporal deterioration of the water status caused by the accidents, natural catastrophes, as for example, extreme floods or extreme droughts. Generally, it is accepted. The next exception, which is probably more important in the working for river conservation, is some acceptation of some river degradation by the new human investments. It is so-called Derogation 4.7, a very important point of Water Framework Directive, which allow to overrule the general idea of achieving good ecological status and good status of the water body and not to deteriorate the status of the water body for so-called overriding public interest as human health, human safety, sustainable development. The deterioration from the high to the good status is also accepted for the new sustainable human development activities if no better environmental options are feasible. This is in fact similar to the Natura 2000 rules and the decision scheme in case of river and in case of Natura 2000 sites, we have a bit similar. In case of project which may affect Natura 2000 sites, we must assess what will be the impact of the project on the site. Generally, the project may be accepted only if there is no negative impact. The exception in the specific circumstances is overriding public interest, but with the situation if no better alternative solution exists. For the degrading waters by the new human investments, the scheme is similar. It is generally not acceptable, but it may be exceptionally accepted in the situation if there is the overriding public interests for such investment transforming river, and if there are no feasible better environmental alternatives for achieving this target. If the conditions are not met, the project degrading river cannot be authorized, cannot be implemented according to the European law. Other side of this coin is the Liability Directive rule, which say that deterioration of the water body status is generally classified as so-called environmental damage. There are some restrictions. It concerns only the deterioration which is caused by so-called hazard activity, but most of activities transforming waters and degrading waters are on the list. The hazard activity is, for example, water storage, water abstraction, discharges into water which normally require prior authorization. In fact, they are all normal activities which may impact the water bodies. And the exception, if the negative impact of the water body is foreseen before implementation and formally accepted as a derogation according to Article 4.7 of the Water Framework Directive, it is accepted and it is not considered as the environmental damage. Maybe also the environmental damage in species and habitats with not exactly the same rule. Such damage is all the negative change in the so-called conservation status of the species and habitats. There is no restriction what activity may be the cause, but there is the exception that if the negative effect is previously foreseen and accepted by the relevant decision of the relevant authority, it is not considered as the environmental damage. but there is no limitation what activity causes this degradation. And general rule of the liability directive is that each case of the environmental damage must be first prevented, and if the prevented is unsuccessful, must be remediated, and the operator who made this damage is generally responsible for this, at least at the end, should file for this. It is very important because it means that if someone pollutes the river without prior authorization, without foreseeing this effect in the environmental report and authorizing this effect, exactly this effect, is responsible for the remediation in such situation. It is not enough that the polluters have the permission for example, the pollution. If the permission is not issued according to the rules of the directives, it's not exclude the classification of the situation as environmental damage with all these legal consequences which follows. But it's nice theory, but some issues must be still clarified. First, what is the water body? Second, what is the water body status? What is the deterioration of the water body status? And what the environmental objectives in fact means. A lot of details are necessary to know if you are going to use that tools in practical river conservation. First, what is the water body? Normally it may be the river, but maybe also the section of the river. And the member states have the discretion, have the possibility to designate the water body as they want, but generally the water body should be the homogeneous. It is some kind of conflict. For better management from the ecological point of view, it would be the best situation if the water body was rather small and homogeneous. But multiplication of the number of water bodies in the country multiply the cost of monitoring, because each water body must be monitored. Therefore, the governments rather don't like create small water bodies, rather prefer the bigger one. If they prefer bigger one, and if they designate bigger one, they will not be homogeneous, and the negative impact, the deterioration, may be sometimes very difficult to prove, which create a much more difficult situation if we are going to define the river using this tool. Here is the map of the fragment of Poland, is the Drava and tributaries, and various colors are the various water bodies. As you see, for lakes, it's no problem. Each lake, of course, each lake big enough is a separate water body. For rivers, it's an issue of how the river should be divided into sections. In some cases, as for example here, this is the Sucha River, the small river is the water body. It's rather clear. But here, the Drava River, the main river in that region, is very, very long water body, about 80 kilometers long, which in fact is not homogeneous because it is consisted of the part protected in the national park and in the part outside the national park, both with quite different ecological character. It may be difficult to practical use of the deterioration time because the deterioration should be proved for in the scale of whole water body. The second important practical issue is that ecological status is normally assessed on the basis of so-called monitoring, which monitoring is located in the control point. The control point is normally located only one point for the river body, and usually the monitoring results are extrapolated for the whole water body. This is the rather weak point of the Water Framework Directive, because it means that the assessment of the ecological status, in fact, may not always be representative for the water body in concept. What about wetlands and small elements? They are not designated as the separate river bodies, and they are not the planning units according to Water Framework Directive. Maybe it is not good, maybe it is the weak point, but we must take it as it is. We can still consider the small wetlands and small water elements as the parts of bigger water bodies, and think about the impact of the small elements for the whole river. And we can still argument that, for example, restoration of wetlands is important for achieving the good ecological status of the big water body at a whole. Such argumentation is still possible under the directive, even if the wetlands are not individually the target of management according to the data. What about the status of the hydromodified water bodies? Hydromorphology must be heavily altered in the past, of course, and it must be so much alteration that achieving good status with this is infeasible. But as I said, the maintaining of this alteration must be still necessary for environment, for other significant human purposes. Without this, there is no possibility to designate even the heavily altered water body as the formerly hydromodified water body. And the benefits of the alteration should not be replaced by the better environmental option. In case of designating of the water body as the hydromodified, the objective is good ecological potential. This is a bit less restrictive, but which means in the fact the closest status to the good ecological status, which is still feasible with approved, accepted alteration of detritus. All this is included to the plans which are prepared in the scale of river basins. This is rather big areas, 2, 3, or several in the country. For each river basin, the plan is prepared, and the plan must list all water bodies, must indicate what water bodies are designated as heavily modified, and what is the ecological objective for each water body. Is the ecological status an objective, or the ecological potential, and if in case of ecological potential, what in fact this ecological potential means. Because for the ecological status, we have the common criteria. We must check the fish, benthic fauna, and water vegetation, and there are the clear criteria. We count so-called multi-indicators which summarize the assessment of the fish. And there's a clear criteria. There is the threshold, that above the threshold the status is good, below the threshold the status is not good, is moderate or lower. And if we consider the ecological potential, the criteria must be established individually for each river, because for each individual river, the alterations which are accepted in the designation are others. And of course, for each river, the ecological potential means the other objectives, in fact. Then the legal work for river conservation starts from the looking to the river basins management plan with the question, what your river formally is? What is the designation of the water body along your river? Is the designation convenient for you, or other case, not very convenient for the legal procedures? Is the water body small and homogeneous, or is the water body designated as a very big and heterogeneous part of the river? These both situations are different and need the other legal procedures in the future work with legal instruments. The second important question is also to look to the plan and to look, is your river designated as a highly modified body or not? It is important because the objectives depend on it. If the river is designated as highly modified water body, what in fact the environmental objectives, what in fact the ecological protection means for the particular river in concern. Water body status, it's composed in from the ecological status and chemical status. And ecological status is assessed on the basis of biological elements, as I say on the basis of fish, benthic fauna, and aquatic vegetation. Hydromorphological elements and physicochemical and chemical elements are supporting elements of quality. If we consider biological elements, there is the rule one out or out. It means that if, for example, fish are in bad status, the general assessment of the ecological status is bad, even if the other two elements are perfect. But the problem is that the rule don't work if we have not assessed all elements. In fact, if we have not assessed all three elements, for example, make the assessment of the ecological status only on the basis of aquatic vegetation, it may be that the aquatic vegetation status is good, and some officers think that ecological status of the river is good. And it's the very common situation in the plans in all European countries, but it is the mistake. Because if we assess only one element and we have the rule one out, all out, we know nothing. We know only that the ecological status is not better than. If we assess only the aquatic vegetation as moderate, we know only that real ecological status of the water body is not better than moderate. But we cannot assess is it moderate in fact, or it is poor or bad, until we know two other elements. This lack of information is in fact a very, very important problem of implementation, and in fact is the reason of some false assessment, which is common in all European countries. We combine the assessment of the ecological status with the chemical status, and here is also one out, all out rule, which means that if the chemical status is below good, the general status must be assessed as bad. Finally, we have the assessment in two categories, good or bad, green or red, and finally, most of the European rivers are red, are still in the bad status, which means that we are far away from achieving the directive objectives, but it is the result of one out or out rule, which is applied to the assessment according to the directive requirements. What about hydromorphology? It is only supportive elements, which means if the hydromorphology of the river is bad, it is not necessary followed by the bad assessment of the ecological status of that water body. We must look at the biological elements. If the biological elements are good, even with bad hydromorphology, the ecological status is good, is S status of the biological elements. It may be asked, what for to assess hydromorphology? One important point, but small, is that distinguishing between high and good assessment need also hydromorphological assessment. But the most important answer is that biological elements normally react on hydromorphology. And the most common status is that we have the bad status of the biological elements, for example, bad status of the fish in the river, and must to ask question and must to find answer why the status is bad. And the assessment of the hydromorphology very often can answer that question. Because if we have the river with clear water, with good physical-chemical status, and with bad hydromorphology, probably the answer why the status of the fish is bad is because of bad hydromorphology, which means what we must do to achieve the objectives, improve the hydromorphology of the river, to implement the restoration concerning river hydromorphology. For example, ecological connectivity. It's rather clear situation. If we have the barriers and we have the bad status of the fish in the river, we must restore connectivity. We must do at least to build fish passes and maybe destroy the barriers and implement deeper restoration. Let's give an example. Such situation if the channel of the river is strongly altered and question why the status of the fish in that river is bad. Probably because of bad hydromorphology. But if we not complete the assessment and assess the status of that river only on the base of aquatic flora, which is in fact not present here at all, both in the natural and transformed status, the formal assessment declared by the authority maybe that the status is good because there is no alteration of water vegetation in that river. And what about fish and benthic fauna? We don't know because it is not monitored. Yeah? This is example of the false assessment, which such assessments are rather common in all European water basin management. What about physical-chemical elements? Temperature, salinity, nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen. This is the most important pollutant, in fact. This is also the supporting element, but here we have the standards, we have the threshold, which distinguish the good assessment and moderate assessment. Then physical-chemical elements we can use directly for the assessing the status. But also the monitoring of the physical-chemical elements is very, very important for finding answer why the status of the biological elements is not good and what block the achievement of the objectives of the good ecological status which are required according to the data. The assessment is in fact a complicated scheme, but what we should remember that the golden rule, one out, all out, which is applied to all biological elements, can work properly only if all elements are assessed. And we must carefully look at the situation in which the river status is declared formally as being in good ecological status, but in the fact the assessment is based on incomplete monitoring, and some elements, some quality elements are abandoned. This is rather common problem in Europe. The next question, if we are going to use the legal tools in river conservation, can be also, the answer can be also found in the river basin management plans. And the questions are how the declared status of your river is assessed. Is the all relevant quality elements are monitored indeed, or only part of them are known and part of them are not known, in fact. And is the hydromorphology assessed? Even if the assessment of the hydromorphology is not directly required for the status assessment, it is very important for thinking about the causes of the bad status of the biology and about thinking what is necessary to improve the situation. Okay, but how to achieve the objectives? If the status of biological elements are inappropriate, if we have the river in bad status, the question is why? Normally, it may be two answers. Inappropriate physicochemistry or chemistry, stop the pollutants, or inappropriate hydromorphology, restore hydromorphology. Most common situation, we don't know why. What we should do in such situation? The common answer of our authorities is we need more research and we need more monitoring and we need more time for doing monitoring and doing research, and maybe we find the answer, and if we find the answer, we can implement relevant measures. It is allowed to, according to the directive? No. I'm afraid we have no time. I'm afraid we have no time because we have the deadline 2075 and no longer prolongation is allowed. And we have, in general, in European law, the precautionary principle, which means that we must take the necessary measures, even if we are not quite sure that they are necessary indeed. That in fact, in situation we don't know, we should both stop pollutants and restore hydromorphology, not waiting more time for clarification of the situation. Restore hydromorphology is the single term, but in fact, restoring hydromorphology, so-called river restoration, is a complex issue. River restoration may be spontaneous. Sometimes doing nothing is enough, and sometimes it is only enough to stop the pressures and natural processes of fluvial dynamics. Maybe semi-spontaneous, to initiate some processes of fluvial dynamics and try to maybe slightly correct the processes, but generally, let's river to restore yourself. And maybe artificial restoration as a recreation of new river channel, as engineering works, which build something new, which build a new ecosystem, novel ecosystem of the river. There are a long list of possible river restoration measures for abandoning the human intervention, from abandoning the maintenance work and allow fluvial morphological processes to the reconstruction of the river channel, to the wetlands restoration in the river valley. And it is a very complex issue, which is in fact is important part of thinking about achieving environmental objectives. The Polish example, the National Plan of Surface Water Restoration was elaborated in 2020, and the conclusion of the plan is that 22% of the Polish river needs more or less advanced restoration. In many situations, stopping the pressure and allowing natural processes would be enough. In some cases, some technical intervention as the restoring connectivity or reshaping river channel would be necessary. It is probably too ambitious to be really implemented, but it is in fact in scale of my country the first view which identify what is the scale of necessary river restoration. What question we should ask? Is the restoration need concerning our river? And if there is a restoration need, is the restoration included to the program of measures in the water basin management plan? Is the relevant scale of that restoration included to the plan? And are the restoration measures implemented indeed? This is the general perspective of the application of the Water Framework Directive. But in fact, if we about legal mechanism, European law is not written in the directive. European law is normally written in the rules of European Court of Justice. For the Water Directive, we have only a few rules. We are in the ongoing process because it is a rather young directive and the tradition of implementation and the tradition of infringement cases and the rules of the European Court of Justice is rather short. But we have some important implementations of the code. First, this is the frame directive. It creates a frame for national policies, not for total harmonization of national legislation. But member states has to adopt all measures which are necessary to achieve environmental objectives. But the code also accepts there is no formal sanction for non-achievement of these objectives. In very important rule for Greek River Ache laws, the code concludes that member state must check does the project before approving of each project, before approving all investment which would impact the river, what will be the impact and will be the negative impact of environmental objectives. The deterioration is generally not allowed, but member states must prohibit all projects which negatively influence the achievement of environmental objectives, even if the project was considered before the accession to the European Union, for example, before the implementation of the directive. Public interest may be the reason for exception, but the public interest as the providing drinking water, the code say that water concerning farming as the corn plantation is not accepted public interest for making the exception from the rule of the directive. The public character of the interest is not enough. In each case, the interest must be individually assessed against the public interest of have the rivers of the good status. Only the authorization in the exception is allowed only if we have no environmental matter alternative. In the weather rule, the code say that member states are required, under the derogation is granted, to refuse authorization of each individual project impacting the water bodies, impacting the river. And very important is the clarification of deterioration. Deterioration means that at least one of the quality elements will be decreased by one class of the assessment. But it is enough to have the decreasing of one element, not the status in general. In the case for the river Milch in Austria, the code say that liability directive is applied to the water bodies and to the water bodies deterioration. In the Schwarz-Sulm rule, which are not very happy for this, the code say that hydroelectricity in specific circumstances may be assessed as public interest, may, under the specific condition, be the reason for making the exception from the general rule. In the rule for the Elbe water power plant in Marburg, the code say that also the impact for Natura 2000 sites far away, 200 kilometers far away, is also the forbidden negative impact. And without assessment of this aspect, the reconstruction of the power plant in Hamburg cannot be approved by the German government. In the last rule for Spain site Donama, the code say that there is the situation of excessive deterioration of the site as a result of water abstraction for the tourism and for the plant production. That situation is not deterioration because it is yet deteriorated, and there is no decreasing of the water, but the so-called permanent deterioration must be reflected in the program of measures, and Spain is obliged to include to the program of measures some measures which address this threat. And it is not only the infringement against the Water Directive, but also against the Habitat Directive for Natura. This is the example how the Natura 2000 sites and Habitat Directive may be the additional umbrella. The requirements of the Habitat Directives are rather outside our today speech, but shortly remember, there are a lot of water-dependent species, as some fish, but also as some birds, as the bog turtle, as the toads, as the beaver, as the otter, and some water-dependent habitats, as in fact all lakes, specific kind of rivers, as for example wetlands, as the bogs and fens, they are elements protected by the Habitat Directive. And the rules of the Habitat Directive must be sometimes very, very useful also for the preventing of the deterioration of water. Remember, there are two parts of the scheme of the approval of the project. The first part is for water issue. The first part is for requirements of the Water Framework Directive. The second one is for Natura 2000 sites if the investment may impact Natura 2000 sites. In both cases, under some circumstances, the project, the investments cannot be approved. Also, the law is not written in the directive, it is written in the rules of the Court of Justice. For the Habitat Directive, we have a rich library. More power plants, I remember Donana, it includes also the elements of the Habitat Directive and many other rules precise and describe what in fact the appropriate assessments means, what must be met for approving the investments. What is important from our point of view are the rules applied in each project, in each individual project. This is the tool for preventing the individual investments deteriorating the river, which in many cases may be very useful in our practical work. There is a lot of links between Water Framework Directives and Nature Directives, and the issue is also very complex. It is clarified in the Commission publication, but generally it is important that in Water Framework Directive there is the concept of not only the concept of water, but also the concept of the protected area, which are water dependent. Protected areas which are designated for the habitats of species which are water dependent are one of them. And for each of such areas, the environmental objectives must be also established, similar as the objectives for the water bodies. We have the complex sets of the objectives in the water catchment areas and the protected areas overlaps. Sometimes the objectives for the species and habitats may be much more restrictive than the normal objectives of the good ecological status, and all such situations we can use in our practical work. But for this, we must think about this in the preparing the management plan for the natural protected area. We must, in the natural plan, we must write clearly what we need in the context of water conditions. We can use these mechanisms for preventing harmful investments. We can use this mechanism for preventing the harmful river maintenance work. We can use this mechanism for including better environmental options to other plans, as for example, flood risk management, and for looking for the better environmental options. We may use that mechanism for enforcing necessary river restoration, at least partial, with some contribution for human needs, but in fact, the tool is rather powerful. All this European system is based on the assessment, status, objectives, programming, implementation of measures, public interest, etc. On the end, I'm only going to talk that there is not a single system in the world. There are some other interesting one, as the American system of designate specific river as the wilderness, as the interesting idea to legal personality of the elements of nature, as the legal personality of the river, implement at least in 3 countries, first in the Colombia, then in India, then in the the best known in New Zealand. And we don't know what will be the future in Europe, in our country, but till now we have rather a lot of legal tools in the Water Framework Directive and in the nature one, which we can use in defense of river. Thank you very much and have a lot of success in your legal battles.